Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a helping side of salutations with an extra bit of welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our great security journey across the adventures which are, security based. But I digress from that and also say hello to producer Jeff. Thank you, as always, for joining in. And yeah, feel free to put your questions in the chat or just say hi. But for you who are joining for the first time, one, welcome. Two, let me introduce myself the professional way because I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the professional services division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And usually I am joined by my co-host Russ, but he is lost in the mythos for now. So you just have to listen to me the whole time, which I'll try to make a little bit fun by asking you questions like, where are you tuning in from? Where are you dialing in from? And we always have a second question as well that I like to kind of throw out there, see how you're doing. And that question today of the icebreaker variety is, would you rather have a vacuum that picks up every dust particle but plays jazz music at maximum volume, or a robot mop that cleans the floors but only in the shape of a question mark? Feel free, put your questions or answers in the comments. So for me, this is a hard one. I would go with the jazz and max volume, even though it's for the detriment of the toddler running around because I couldn't just do the question marks. It would look like the Riddler was at my house every day. So I would just pick the afternoon times and play the loud jazz music. Hopefully I can control what song comes out so I can find one that I like. But yeah, I would say, Ari, thank you. Yeah, the jazz. You do like some jazz. It'd be a good little adventure into something, right? So from the perspective of jumping in, I'm glad you're excited, Ari, because the title of today's episode is also Get Excited, because we were talking about some automated response capabilities within AWS. So as you continue to ponder about that jazz, I'll jump into that. Because last week, if you recall, we come from the 10 billion events, one detection, AWS detection engineering fundamentals. And today's topic is kind of the continuation of that from the technical standpoint as well as the themed standpoint. Because what we're trying to get to is, how do we handle something like 10 billion events coming into your environment and having a limited amount of detections? And how do we build detection signals into our automated response capabilities? And that's the part where you get excited, because there's so many ways that you can go about this, especially leveraging the different tools that AWS makes available to you. When you think of it just from the perspective of, hey, what logging sources am I consuming? You think of the CloudTrail, the VPC flow logs, Route 53 resolver queries, so on and so forth. But in today's episode, what we're trying to get to and understand is, all right, what is the science of speed when it comes to this? How do we have our engineering response formula? Because we spoke about the fundamentals. Now that we have the fundamentals in place, we can get to the part of the fun where we start to develop the formula to say, how do we make this more efficient? And then we start to get to the part of, okay, how do we turn that alert to action in seconds? Where, one, we have the human loop capabilities, but we also have the automated mechanisms to respond to things that occur within your environment at an expedited rate, right? Because if you get the theme of this episode and last episode, 10 billion points to you, which is also part of that theme, you get into the part of, how do I awaken the response capabilities within my environment? How do I build a response civilization, a response mindset, so that I have multiple accounts within my environment that can let's say, soar at scale, so that we get to the part of the puzzle where we have 10 billion% containment. And I keep saying 10 billion% because that's part of the Easter egg of today's episode. But it's also the mindset of how you're looking at your environment. Because you're not thinking of one or two alerts. You're thinking of hundreds and thousands and millions of alerts that may come through your environment. And how do you handle these? How do you measure your response maturity? Because alerts may be generated, but were actions taken from those alerts? And sometimes the capabilities exist within your own organization environment. But there's the scary part of automating that. We have customer conversations about, right? They say the scariest part of automating response could be something like, well, what if it takes the wrong action that breaks a real workload? Or if they miss a threat and create kind of false confidence with the automation. We also hear that, hey, we can't roll back if something happens. These are common sentiments that we hear when we're speaking about automation. And because of that, we often hear that question of, okay, leadership won't approve us taking this path unless there are these 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of human approval, right? Which can reduce the acceleration capabilities of the organization, because now there's more debates about, okay, should we automate this alert that generates and does all of this other things in the workflow and have 6 layers of sign-offs on it, right? So when you start to get to that portion, you first say hello to hello world, but you also say, okay, what are the next steps? And the next steps exist within the science of speed, specifically to your engineering formula. We're continue on that engineering theme because that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to build out engineering capabilities from a security, let's say, perspective when it comes to answering and automating response in your AWS environment. Because if you try to handle 10 billion alerts manually, one at a time, then you can get into some territories that may require a lot of personnel. And then all those things you just mentioned that are the scariest part of automating come into, let's say, perspective of they're going to happen with that approach. The wrong action could break real workloads. Well, if you have so many alerts, sometimes an alert can cause a responder to take an action that may break real workloads. Or you might miss a threat because you have false confidence. Oh, I have this many personnel, so we should be covered. Well, false confidence. We can't roll back if something goes wrong. Well, if you have mechanisms in place for that responder to make changes, but you don't have ways for them to, let's say, unroll out a change easily, then same boat as automation. So these are the common themes that you hear. So one of the things that you start to look towards is, how do I automate this? How do I get to that point of, hey, I got this covered? That's where the science and the engineering formula that we're speaking about comes into play, which usually comes in 5 steps, right? And they're based off a pipeline. You trigger the pipeline, you enrich it, you decide, you act, and you verify. Trust but verify. I heard that. It's a popular phrase. But part of it is the trigger. This is the smoke detector analogy, right? So this event is the thing that starts a workflow. Typically something from, let's say, a security hub finding, or a guard duty alert, or a CloudTrail event, or it matches some event bridge pattern that you created, right? So just like a smoke detector detects, hey, there's a fire, just like it senses there's something going on. And think of it that way. Smoke detector senses something and alerts on it. Same type of mechanism when we're thinking of what triggers. So the trigger stage doesn't make, let's say, the decision. It just routes the signal forward. It says, hey, there's smoke building up. Take this action, right? And if you want to enrich that as the second phase, now you start to think of it like this is, let's say the workflow pulls additional context before taking action. So this can be your IAM tags, your config history, so on and so forth, right? This is similar to like a dispatcher asking, oh, is the person breathing? Are they conscious? Are they're getting additional context before sending some type of help? That's where the enrichment comes in. And then the deciding factor is, okay, now the workflow starts to evaluate the enriched context that you provided and sends the right amount of help. Or I should say, the appropriate path to the response. This is where you get to that fully automated containment and the human approval gates, whichever method you go by. But it's the deciding factor, it's the triaging step, so that you can get to the act, right? Where you actually have the workflow execute something. And that execution is choosing the type of action that occurs. Are you revoking sessions? Are you quarantining instances? Are you taking a snapshot of the disk? So on and so forth. And then the last piece is verifying. And that verification comes from, okay, now that the workflow has been executed, right, we actually confirm that it did what it was supposed to do. It's querying CloudTrail, right, to make sure that, hey, there's no more API actions to whatever just happened, right? It's checking the security groups was actually replaced if something were to occur from a security group perspective. It's almost like the surgeon is confirming, like, hey, okay, the stitch is holding. And I use all these analogies because this is a very important part of, hey, how do we get to that automated response workflow? Because each one of these pieces in that 5-stage pipeline I discussed, one can be automated. You can have a agentic workflow built into each one of these pieces to say, okay, trigger based on this, right? We spoke about something simple like even an event bridge pattern, right? If it matches these criteria, then you can trigger the next step. But the enrichment is the interesting component, because how do you enrich your data today within your environment? Do you enrich it? Or do you just send everything to a given system like your SIM? And those are the questions and responses that are very interesting. And that's what you get excited about, right? It's like, all right, how do we delve into this a little bit more? Right? Because is a critical the same for everybody? Is a high the same for everybody? Or is a low the same for everybody? Well, this is where the context comes into play. And this is how you enrich your data. Because if you have things like IAM tags or the config history, like we were speaking about, now you start to see how you can kind of influence and enhance your overall response to something. Because each stage that I just laid out matters, right? So if you think of it that way, skipping enrichment causes the wrong actions. Skipping verifications causes, let's say, silent failures. Because, yeah, it did what it's supposed to do. It triggered, right? But how do you verify that it was actually complete? That's where the trust but verify comes into place. So you want to know the differences in each one of these stages and make sure that you're carrying out the right actions in each one of these stages. So that's why I take the dramatic pause to correlate that to what are the known incident response, the containment, the eradication, the recovery, right? And the automation for each one of those steps has to be appropriate based on the maturity level of the organization, right? Crawl, walk, run. A simple methodology that we like to speak about, because all these steps, they have so many paths you could go down. Because when you start to think about, okay, something, let's say deleted your IAM policies, right? Or terminate compromised EC2 instances or something along those lines. How do you handle those things when they happen? So to handle these, you have to think about your current maturity level of what services you have active within your environment. Think of something like, all right, let's say you have a response pipeline of Event Bridge, then you go to Lambda, to a step function, to Systems Manager, to CloudWatch. Do you have mechanisms based on all of those different items? Can you speak to, let's say, something like a step function within your environment? And what is your step function actually doing? I think those are each key pieces of the puzzle. So when you start to go down this route, this is where we can start to jump around and get excited. So the first part of this, I would say, is, all right, let's speak about what a step function is. Choose your path, right? It's an interesting piece of the puzzle that you start to get to. So when you look at, okay, how do I look at choosing my path? You start to say, okay, something happens from a choice perspective, right? So how do you deal with this? In this example, you see that, okay, you have your default path and then you have your condition. So the default path, you have a Lambda invoked that starts a data processing job and then it ends, right? Or you have the alternate where the condition is met and then it does something else. And these are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to start to think about from a step functioning standpoint, right? Because as we were laying out the 5 steps earlier, this is a complete section of it that you have to consider, right? Because remember, you can't skip any of the different steps. So as you go through, as Ari mentioned, step 1, scream into the void, right? And yeah, instant response. And then step 2, after you scream into the void and you get that out of your system, you start to think of, okay, these are the paths. This is the items that you're kind of looking for, right? And I know it's past May the 5th, but or May the 4th, I should say, but I had to say it. So when you start to go down this route again, now we start to think about, all right, what is the hypothesis that I'm trying to get to, that I'm trying to understand within my environment, right? So if we take that step back to consider what a step function is and how it attributes to the workflow, all right, so when a detection fires against a resource type, the safe automated action is containment with verification. Let's say that's my response hypothesis workflow, right? And I put this as a hypothesis because it's assuming all these different pieces that you can plug in. Yeah, and step 2, yeah, step 2 is screaming to avoid again. Then you get to step 3. So part of it is understanding from your hypothesis framework. Say if guard duty fires unauthorized access against the EC2 instance role, okay, the safe automated action that can be taken is deny all session policies rolled to the active sessions, right? And then verify that via CloudTrail, you don't see any further API calls. So this is kind of a safe piece of the puzzle. And this is how you start to build out your different frameworks and your different pieces of the puzzle that you will take forward into your automated response workflow. But I know the question you ask yourself is, 1, can we move up screaming into the void? But 2, how do I know how to create these different workflows? Because there are so many different types of techniques and ways I have to account for. Well, last week we kind of went over MITRE ATT&CK and the different techniques and responses that you can have. But the expanded part of this, the question part of this, is more framed around of how do I take the first step? And then how do I take the second step? So a piece that I say is, one, coming up with that hypothesis response framework, but two, understanding each one of those 5 steps in the pipeline process, because then you can start to build from there. And you could take each one of those one piece at a time, and then you can start to define and design your response capabilities appropriately, right? So all these are pieces of the puzzle. So if you start to think about exactly what types of automated responses were covered earlier, and the part that we covered earlier is the 5 steps of trigger, enrich, decide, act, and verify, the automated response workflow, and then the different pieces that go into each one of those, right? And yeah, there's a lot of different attack vectors, and that's why scaling is so important, and that's why, again, get excited. It's a theme. I'm going to keep saying it until producer Jeff says not to, but producer Jeff likes to say it too. So when we think about our decision to implement these different workflows, you start to think about, okay, one, I have the overarching framework that we spoke about. Now I can start to discuss the different services that can fit into these different pieces of the framework, so that I can start to say, hey, how can I scale something that has safety built into it? So that, hey, if I'm running the same response twice, it should produce the same outcome, right? It's critical for the retry logic to say, hey, at least once this happens, if it happens again, the same exact thing should happen. I should know the outcome of something, right? So that it's not like, oh, if this occurs this time, it'll do this, and this occurs this time, it might do this, right? You want the same effects to occur, right? So that you can get to, if something needs to be rolled back, I know exactly how to roll this back. Because every containment action should have a documented and tested reversal path before it's approved for automation. I know it's an extra step. I know it's an extra page in the run book. But if something were to occur, you want to have that mechanism in place. So you can map detection findings to response actions using the AWS security findings format. That's one of the pieces. But the other piece is just understanding severity logic, right? You have your low findings, ticket creation, medium, enrichment plus human approval, right? It's a routing flow that you can create for your organization. And that's all part of it. Because, yes, the baseline policies and pieces of the different services are great. But what you want to do is tweak these based on, one, what are your compliance frameworks you have to follow? But two, what are your business outcomes from the perspective of, hey, if this were to happen to this system, I want these different mechanisms in place. And then you work backwards from that, right? You speak about identity and data protection and so on and so forth, so that you can create your own little matrix based on all these different pieces that are out there. So again, if we start to think about, okay, what is the science of speed? Now, how do we get to the place that we want to awaken our response capabilities? We want to go from alert to action in seconds. And that's where we were speaking about the step functions and how it was a very important part of the puzzle. And you may say, hey, there's also lambdas, aren't there? Can we just use a lambda? Well, this is where the fun part comes in, where you have step functions and you have lambdas. The differences are like between, let's say, a conductor and a single musician, right? So a lambda is that musician playing one instrument really well, right? It can play the keyboard. It can play that jazz, right, just with the keyboard. But when it comes to complex incident response, it's a symphony requiring coordination and timing and harmony across many instruments. And that's why you start to lean towards step functions, right? Because a step function can ensure that every musician plays the right note at the right time. And that's an important part of, let's say, your automation response capabilities. Is making sure the right instrument, because if one instrument sounds off, if you have that kazoo playing in your band or your orchestra, you're going to hear that kazoo if it doesn't come in at the exact right time. So that's all part of see, just like Victor saying hello, exact right time, right? So when you start to delve into it, that's an important part of the puzzle. And to your point, Hello World, I would say it's a tool that should be part of your overarching toolkit, right? So I wouldn't say it's the main tool, it's one of the tools. So when you start to think about it in that fashion, right, you have a conductor, but you still have all the different musicians, right, with the different instruments they need to play. So this is how you start to think of your overall workflow and how you're handling it within your organization. So you can start to have, let's say, state machines, design patterns, responses, linear pipelines, so on and so forth. But can you use Lambda step function, or is it completely different? So it's completely different. So you can have different calls out, because think of the step function as state machines that can carry out different actions. So with those actions, you can trigger different, let's say, reactions. And within that, you can have a Lambda, let's say, invoke to get data or something along those lines. So you can have it inside, but it's different, right? Because just like going back to that orchestra, is a musician is part of the orchestra, right? But they're only controlling their one instrument. They're not the one conducting everybody. And if they were, it brings a little bit more chaos because they are focused on their one instrument. So thank you for that question. So now, if we start to go down the route of figuring out, okay, if you have step functions, how can you continue to, let's say, decide exactly, going back down to that point of Lambda. So if you have AWS Lambda, one of the pieces that you can have it for within your overarching design is enrichment, decision logic, or some lightweight remediations, right? So the enrichment Lambda in your flow can be something to query your IAM tags. And then also look at your AWS config history, like we were mentioning. These are the pieces of the puzzle that you want to add in, because what is it doing? Well, it's adding to that context. Before we're comparing it to like a dispatch of like getting all the questions of what's happening, what's the status, what is the name, all those kind of things. That's kind of where that Lambda from an enrichment perspective comes from. Now, if you start to think of it that way, now you start to see how things piece together. Because if I have an enrichment Lambda, then I can also have a decision Lambda that can say, hey, evaluate this based on the context, severity, and resource criticality, and take this action to route it to the appropriate workflow. So this is all part of the automation workflow and the response capabilities. But I think the main part to take away from this is understanding what all these services are, and then two, the fundamental pieces where you're thinking about your decision pipeline, your automated workflow pipeline. And the best way to scale and understand these pieces is to kind of look through the legendary pieces that are out there. And by legends, I mean previous customer experiences, friend experiences, things you've seen or read in the AWS blogs. But on this show, we call it As SideQuest Legend Has It. Because why? Well, we have a nice little jingle to go with it. And Jeff is singing the jingle, but kind of has this theme of going on an adventure, on a quest. And I would do my announcer voice, but I need more coffee for that. So SideQuest Legend Has It is our segment of the show where we delve into customer stories that relate to our topic and pieces of how they got excited to leveraging automated responses. I told you, I'm just going to keep saying and get excited. But part of the capabilities, part of the journey is understanding our side quest board. And our side quest board is that visual representation of the story that we're telling in the paths that we are mapping out and traversing. So feel free to jump in to say hi in the chat while you're doing that. So I will provide later once a serial. Da-dee-dee, da-dee-dee. Right. It all helps you to get into the mood of understanding. So today's side quest, let's delve into a fun story, depending on how you look at it. Fun, exciting story of how you can improve your security posture. Let's say we have Meridian Care Health Networks. That sounds like a completely fictitious name, so we will go with it. They thought they mastered the art of detection engineering because maybe they listened to our episode last week. But as leading in the clinical decision support and patient data orchestration platform, they have the capabilities to have integrated delivery networks. They have specialty clinics. They have telehealth providers, so on and so forth. Right? Everything is looking great, especially as I organize the AWS banner. But if they have over 120 plus hospitals, they have 41 million active patient records. They're following HIPAA and high trust and GDPR and SOC 2. Throw one last one in there. So they have all these mechanisms in place. You may say, hey, why are we speaking about that? Well, it came to the understanding that our Meridian Health, maybe they had a gap that emerged after an audit. They said, hey, something happened from a ransomware perspective. Now they are trying to understand how they can better enhance their capabilities. Well, the CISO was confident. The detections existed. The council, the board was awake. And they thought they would have catch this. They open Security Hub and they see, well, a high severity custom detection for anonymous assume role from an unexpected, let's say, source IP. You can kind of see how this story is going because then the NOC or the SOC fell silent, let's say. So now after remediating, they've tried to figure out how they should start to build out their environment in order to protect against this, because this was their environment where they had, let's say, the event from an assume role perspective from an unknown IP. So now, if we carve that out, that kind of looks a little bit closer to this, where it's a direct path to the AWS environment, right? Because they did have mechanisms like Security Hub in place, but it seems like there was no actions that were taken on it. So they had the tools, but the tool was just sitting over here, taking in the different pieces of the environment. But it goes back to, if the tool doesn't have any custom actions configured, then it makes it harder to detect unless somebody is going in there, right? And sorry, thank you. It's a cool board. Yeah, this is one of one, custom made. And by custom made, I cut out all these individually, right? So as I get back to the story, when you start to think about what they could have done a little bit differently, it starts to come from the point of, let's break down the different threat attack vectors, the different techniques that were used in order to grant that assume role access, especially from an unknown IP. Well, one, there was no automated containment workflow. So think about this. If a workflow of containment existed from, let's say, the credentials exfiltration finding, then the detection would have been caught, and then it would have been triaged, and then the threat would have been routed and alerted through mechanism of choice. It could have been something like Slack or Event Bridge rule or your step function workflow. But it wasn't in there. That's one piece that could have changed. And wait, no automated EBS snapshot capabilities. So say they had these different volumes in place. Did they have automation from that snapshot perspective? And you start to think outside the different pieces of the puzzle, right? Because this is all pieces that you have to consider, especially when you're building out your environment. Because if you have services like Guard Duty, if you have services like CloudTrail, as I put them face up, you start to figure out, okay, these services, they go into my centralized logging archive account if I built out a control tower instance, right? So part of this is going down the route of one, hey, do I have the different attack techniques? And to the point, when should I start being concerned about the upcoming robot conquest? It should be interesting to have a side quest based on robotics. That'd be interesting, right? What guardrails, what mechanisms you have to have in place, especially from prompt engineering or just other agentic workflows. Thank you for that. And to Hello World's point, Macy could definitely help here just from a perspective of making sure that you have all the automated detections. So what I will do, I will put Macy face up in detect mode for any sensitive data classifications. So thank you for that. So we also have to add this little thing in for Macy. So Macy's going to your centralized logging archive accounts as well. So you're having all these mechanisms go there. But the one piece that we're trying to get to is the understanding that, hey, we have to also triage something, right? So what if I could get it in frame, a step function was here? What would that step function do? Okay? What is the ideal workflow from this? Would it be to say, hey, if these type of alerts come in, then it takes an action? That's an important concept, because based on what we were speaking about earlier, that was everything that we were getting excited about, one, but also two, it opened up a bunch of capabilities. Because if some unknown is in the environment, no matter what area is in, from proximity perspective, you're going to get alerted because you have your unauthenticated or your unauthenticated user here, your unauthenticated user here, right? You're going to see these API calls. So if something does happen, especially from an unknown IP, then you start to get to the point of, okay, I'm starting to build out the different workflows that help the maturity of my mean time to contain. It helps my overall coverage, right? And also, you can start to also have some human in the loop capabilities. Because if in our story, a lot of leadership was saying, hey, you have to have human in the loop approval gates. Well, that's something we could bake in. And I think that's an appropriate place to hit the pause game, our good old Zach Morris timeout, and take that step back to say, hey, what are we trying to achieve with having these different workflows? Right? Some may say it's security, but others may say, okay, why am I leveraging all these services when I can do X? Or can I just have everything be handled by one thing? And that's where the dramatic pause comes in, because we always speak about defense in depth. And a piece of your defense in depth strategy is looking at exactly that, is looking at all of your accounts and all the mechanisms you have in place to make sure that if you have a multi-account environment, how do you have something that you can start out small and then scale as you continue to add those accounts or more accounts to your accounts, right? You're building a response civilization, as I called it earlier. So if you have a multi-account SOAR that needs to be at scale, How do you do so? How do you have cross-account response orchestration? So when you start to feel like, hey, sounds more like defense in breadth. So it's interesting, right? Because when you look at it from all these perspectives, the depth comes into, let's say in our last customer story, we had all these logs. What is taking in all of these logs and alerting on them, right? Because if you are just sending out all of your alerts, then you can, one, have the alert fatigue, but two, are you necessarily enriching those different items? And three, are you waiting for a human to take action on those? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. Because as you start to think about, okay, what is my cross-account response orchestration? Now you start to think about all the different parts of what goes into each of those accounts and how they naturally connect together. Do you have Security Hub as kind of the air traffic controller for your AWS organization, where every finding from every region and every account flows up into that single pane of glass, where the central security team can see and prioritize everything and then act? Or if you don't have Security Hub aggregation, does every account become its own isolated control tower with no visibility into what's happening next door? Those are all questions that you start to think about, because if you have the aggregation architecture in place, now you have member accounts in every region where you can have guard duty, inspector, Macy, as somebody mentioned, in place. And then you can cross-region aggregate these different findings into a single designated aggregator. And from there, centralized response does matter when you're thinking about, how does my organization think about the science behind the speed and how we handle alerts? And centralization gives you that pane of glass that you're looking for. But it also adds to the response automation capabilities of your organization. Because now, if you have everything aggregated in a certain way, now you can take the approach that we mentioned before with step functions and the actions, the checks, right? Because if something were to occur, do you check it in your organizational trail? Do you check it from a guard duty finding? Do you check VPC full logs? Right? And then you can start to, if you have everything in Security Hub, maybe you have the Security Hub custom actions, right? And what I mean by that is if you can fire an event bridge event to respond or route to the appropriate workflow, then you start to think about, okay, are my custom actions the big red button when it comes to incident response? Victor says, first to mitigate and then log in. So that's it. Interesting. First to mitigate. So when you think of the mitigation item, you have to think about a couple different aspects of that. Is how do you mitigate within your environment? That goes into the containment, that goes down to how you shut things down, and that's all part of the workflow, right? So if you have the technical workflow of, all right, analyst clicks quarantine instance, and that becomes a custom Security Hub finding, right? That Security Hub finding fires event bridge rule, so on and so forth. Now you can start to think about it a couple of different ways, right? And one of those ways kind of stems back to, how am I handling incident response in my entire environment? How do I handle blocking in my entire environment? Because we spoke about the post actions, and we also spoke about the pre-actions. What are the pre-actions? Well, taking service control policies and having the automated containment boundaries to start off with, where they can't even launch these different items, right? So if you have SCPs as your initial response, well, the way to think of it, SCPs are really the last resort if something were to happen, because you should have all these other mechanisms in place within your pipeline, within your organization, the way your overall workflows are designed, right? And Victor mentions Kiro. And part of that, and Kiro can help with the SCPs, right? Do you have SCPs? Do you have tag-based SCPs, right? Where you're dynamically applying restrictive SCPs to accounts tag? Or do you have other mechanisms and workflows that you have to think about, right? What we've seen some customers do is they have the Slack or Microsoft Teams or the Jira integrations so that if something were to occur within the environment, then, okay, now this series of steps are taken, a ticket created, right? There's human approval gates before action happens. And that's all part of the puzzle that you're trying to get to, right? And I think part of this is prioritizing your overall workflow. What I mean by that is, one, how you define your workflow. What is your formula? But two, what are you looking at from your environment perspective that you perceive that, hey, we can add some additional items here, right? So is it something like, if I can prioritize one thing to get into place this year, what would it be? Would it be compromised IAM credentials? We need to put something in place for that. Or malware on unauthorized software on EC2 instances. It all takes steps. And that's where you break things down to the ones and zeros, as I say, in order to figure out, hey, what's important to the organization, right? Which one would you prioritize? And that simple question can lead to, let's say, long debates between different stakeholders, because everybody has a different idea of which approach to take, right? So I think that's one part of the puzzle that you have to go down. The other piece is just getting to the point where you feel like you have 10 billion% containment. And I say 10 billion because, one, Easter egg, but two, this is how you get to your measured response maturity, right? The response metrics that matter, right? The mean time to contain, the mean time to recover, automation coverage rate, your automation success rate, your rollback frequency, because you can say, hey, we did it every single time, but we had to roll back every time as well, right? Those are the metrics that you're looking at, because from mean time to contain is the time from the detection finding to the active containment action, right? So what is your primary resource of your response? Or what is your primary measure of your response, I should say? So these are all pieces that you have to think about, but you also have to think about, all right, do I have my detections and versions and everything code-based? Because if they're not code-based, then you can see how all those metrics I just mentioned kind of go up in terms of time to do it, because they're all part of your puzzle, your overall target state security strategy, right? Because if you don't have the CI/CD pipelines for automation as a whole, or just deployment, then you can start to run into the issue of, okay, this was deployed via console. Now, how do we roll back? What did they do inside the console? Oh, well, we can scrape the logs and we can do, but that's all adding to all those metrics we just spoke about. And I think the easiest way to kind of go about this is starting with the basics. First, the certificate knowledge of just going towards understanding what the difference between a lambda and a step function is, and how you can have a lambda in the step function. But also going on your own knowledge quest, where if you're going on knowledge quest, now you can start to think of the different pieces that apply to your puzzle. And today's knowledge quest is just a way that you can figure out, hey, this is how I build Aura, within understanding how we can kind of one, shift left because automation, DevSecOps is an important item to consider, especially when you have these different metrics. But also, how you can start out building your overarching maturity level. So if we were to take, step one with our theme of going from the Stone Age, right, with our theme, and going into the technology-based approach, well, you have to start out as kind of like that apprentice, right? You're the villager one, if you were an NPC, right? And figure out how the steps that you became more knowledgeable, one piece at a time. And part of that relies in just going through the process of, right, this is a step function. This is what a step function does within the environment. And Victor says, audit may be impact, but I'm not sure the most easy way of logging for a great and recovered host over the agents or machine learning. So part of, if I understand your question correctly, is going through the process of how do you, one, log different items that are appropriate for an instant response workflow, but two, how you can enhance your overarching workflow, whether that be through different services, through AI agents with machine learning, where if you have an incident responder, you can do a lot of the triaging and picking up of the different pieces of the puzzle, that enrichment, so that by the time it gets to your incident responder, they have a better picture that they don't have to dig through using some of those machine learning aspects. So thank you for that. But that L100, that villager apprentice, what is Lambda? That's an important part. As we described earlier, you have that one musician, that's Lambda. It knows its instrument inside and out. It has a targeted piece of the puzzle that it caters to, right? So if you know that that's the targeted piece, now you go to your conductor piece, which was the step function. Now you can start to figure out the different ways that you can, automate using something like EventBridge and what EventBridge can entail for your organization. And this is how you build up your L100 knowledge. This is how you start off, just going through the process of breaking things down to the ones and zeros, so that eventually you get to the place where you're using custom actions to send findings and insights, that enrichment step that we were speaking about, to EventBridge to trigger your overall workflow. And I know once you get past that part, now you can start thinking of, okay, I'm going from that general apprentice to a science engineer, right? You're an engineer of science because you're building out the science of response, the science of an automated workflow within your environment, so that it entails, now you can get to the pieces of the puzzle that, one, I would say, excite you, but also the pieces that are most tailored and customized to your overall organizational goal, right? That's the piece of the puzzle that you want to get to, because all these different items are steps along the path that you're taking to get to your overarching target state security strategy, right? So that you can eventually get to the place that says, hey, what are we using just to access the environment? Can we use something different? It's all part of the scientific method, if I were to use that joke, but also it's all part of just saying, hey, maybe we're accessing through a means where we can leverage systems manager for, let's say, incidents. How do we use that? How does this entail, right? How does this build out a dedicated incident lifecycle into my environment so that it's appropriate and customized, that fits my needs, right? So these are all pieces of the puzzle of how you become that L200, that science engineer, right? So if something were to happen, now you have the different mechanisms, one, to say, hey, we're going to do this, but if we need to disable permissions, temporary security credentials only, these are all part of the puzzle pieces of building out your IR workflow. so that you eventually get to the piece of understanding that, hey, we can continue to mature and get better so that we are 10 billion% capable detection architects. So that when we get to multi-account environments, we can start to leverage the different tools and mechanisms like Security Hub Delegated Administrator, responses code using CDK and CloudFormation. We could understand how it applies and how we can leverage each piece of the puzzle, from service control policy, using, maybe we can do service control policy and have policies deployed as automated containment boundaries. You see how the different pieces start to fit together from there. Because now that's deployed and you can have the human in the loop, you start to have those different pieces of the puzzle of your overarching workflow. Just things to think about. So as you think about all the things that happened in today's episode, I think the main takeaway is to break everything down to the simple aspects. Exactly what we were speaking about is, if I were to come up with that workflow of trigger, enrich, decide, act, and then verify, I can add to my overarching, let's say, puzzle. And once you do, you can get to the place of not only leveling up yourself, but leveling up your environment within AWS and probably even beyond. And doing so helps you to build out all of your different plans of the target state, as well as your incident response strategy. And once you see that completed in that iteration, whatever version it is, that's where you start to get excited. So, last one for the episode. But until next time, I would say continue to build up those 1 XP point, one piece at a time, and then level up. So until then, thank you for joining, and tune back. No episode next week, but the week after that, we shall have another fun one that you can get excited to. Now I'm done. All right, thank you for joining. Until next time, have a great one. Happy Monday.